Doran the Siege Tower. This big treefolk was printed in 2007's Lorwyn. It was the first card to ever allow creatures to assign combat damage equal to their toughness instead of their power. An effect we've seen a whole lot of since 2007. But Doran isn't only noteworthy in the history of Magic because he opened up some new design space, he was also a dominant card in Magic 60 card formats between 2007 and 2010, and was still putting up top finishes as late as 2015. However, as good as Doran was, it's been so long since he's been a good Magic card in 60 card formats that most players today think of him as a card that has only ever been viable in Commander. So, that begs the question, how good was Doran, actually? This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of How Good Was It? A series where I take a historical deep dive on Magic cards whose best competitive days are behind them. As usual, I ran a poll to determine the topic of this video. This time around it was a showdown between two powerful multicolored creatures, and it ended up being a very close poll, with Doran the Siege Tower narrowly beating out Spiritmonger. My goal going forward is to put out one of these How Good Was It videos each month, and right now there's a poll on the community tab where you can choose between two Phyrexian creatures with big downsides that were really good back in the day, Phyrexian Colossus and Phyrexian Negator. Go and vote in the poll to choose which one I look at in March. Alright, before we take a look at the types of decks that Doran was played in, let's take a look at the card itself and break down how it works. For a white, a black, and a green, Doran is a legendary 0/5 Treefolk Shaman, and it makes it so that each creature assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. This means that Doran is effectively a 3-mana 5/5, which was a fairly absurd stat line in 2007. Furthermore, this effect is symmetrical. This means you can build your deck with this effect in mind, while any creature your opponent has with lower toughness than power ends up getting nerfed. So let's take a look at the types of decks Doran was played in during its heyday, starting with the Lorwyn Block Constructed format. Block Constructed is a format where only cards from a few consecutively released sets that are interconnected by lore and mechanics are legal. While all blocks have small card pools, that was especially true of Lorwyn Block, which was the first to consist of only 2 sets. Lorwyn Shadowmoor was a block dominated by decks built around specific creature types, and while Treefolk were one of the supported creature types in that block, there weren't truly any pure Treefolk decks that were successful at the highest level of competition. However, Doran decks were as close as it got. Even if it wasn't purely a Treefolk deck, there are some Treefolk payoffs that helped make Doran good in block and in other formats too. One of them was Murmuring Bosk, a land that can produce all 3 Abzan colors, but only enters tapped if you reveal a Treefolk from your hand. The other was Treefolk Harbinger. The Harbinger was 1 green mana for a 0/3 that could tutor up a Treefolk and put it on top of your library. This was the perfect combo with Doran because it made sure you would find the creature your deck was named for, but it also meant that the Harbinger could smash in for 3 when it attacked. Leaf Crowned Elder was also a Treefolk that was an amazing fit for the deck. Not only did it have an attractive 3/5 stat line, it also has a kinship trigger at the beginning of your upkeep, where you look at the top card of your library, and if it shares a creature type with the Elder, in other words, if it was either a Treefolk or a Shaman, you could play it without paying its mana cost. This, of course, would include Doran, but it worked for most of the creatures in the deck. While the rest of the deck didn't have any other high toughness creatures to really abuse Doran, the rest of the deck, with the exception of Shriekmaw, consisted of creatures with equal power and toughness so that they wouldn't get nerfed by Doran. Doran decks were right up there with Fairies and Kithkin during Lorwyn Block Constructed, but Doran would find even more success in formats with larger card pools. In fact, Doran found success in Standard before Lorwyn Block was even complete, and he did it on the biggest stage of them all. Uri Peleg's Doran Rock deck won Worlds in 2007, and this deck shows you one of the biggest advantages Doran decks in Standard had over Doran decks in Block. Birds of Paradise and Lana War Elves were both legal in this Standard format, making turn 2 Doran a real possibility. Furthermore, there were more creatures around that could take advantage of Doran's buff. Even Birds of Paradise can attack for 1 once Doran joins the fray. Other creatures who benefited were Oran Viper and the already insanely strong Tarmogoyf, who really didn't need Doran to be around to be an incredibly efficient creature. In other words, Doran made one of the most heavily played creatures in the format even better, and that's a good recipe for a card to find lots of success. Doran decks would continue to be successful as long as the Treefolk Shaman was legal in Standard, and the additions of the aforementioned Harbinger and Murmuring Bosk both helped make Doran an even more effective centerpiece in the deck. By 2009, he may not have had access to the same mana dorks who could power him out in 2007, but Noble Hierarch also worked really well with Doran between helping players cast it on turn 2 and being a 0-1 with Exalted. This little mana dork would allow Doran to grow to a 1-6 when it attacked, and the Hierarch itself could swing for 2 with Doran in play. By this point, it's worth noting that Vendilion Click was one of the most heavily played cards in Standard, since it was a powerful card in a vacuum, and Fairy decks made it even better. So the fact that Doran effectively turned it into a 1-1 flyer was frequently very relevant. It was just a terrible attacker and blocker while Doran was on the battlefield, and that made a big difference. This rivalry between Fairy and Treefolk would continue into Extended and Modern too. Speaking of Extended, Doran was also incredibly successful there. It's a now defunct rotating format, a lot like Standard, except it included an extended number of sets. In other words, it included sets released over the last 5 years or so. Doran was a significant force in Extended between 2008 and 2011. It was during this period that decks featuring the Treefolk took on the humorous name Doran the Explorer in reference to a certain educational children's cartoon, but even with the new moniker, these decks didn't look significantly different from what was going on in Standard around the same time. Treefolk, Harbinger, Tarmogoyf, and Doran were all still having a really great time together. The presence of Chrome Mox in the format still allowed for an early Doran. It was also a good place to imprint an extra one, since it would be able to produce all 3 Abzan colors. One notable thing about this deck is that it did use some creatures who actually got nerfed by Doran, Dark Confidant and Eternal Witness, although those 2 amazing value creatures already aren't really kept around for their ability to attack and block anyway. By 2010, these decks looked quite a bit different, both as a result of rotation and the printing of new cards, although the usual core we've grown used to in this video was still present, in other words, Tarmogoyf, Harbinger, and Doran. Loam Lion was printed that year and was a great fit for a Doran aggro deck since it loved forests, something that Doran needed, and its toughness became higher than its power as soon as you controlled one. Doran decks continued to be successful into 2011, but then the Extended format was retired and replaced with a new format, one that still exists today, Modern. This format didn't have rotation, and instead all sets with modern card frames were legal, in other words all sets from 8th edition forward. Even this seismic change in Magic formats didn't put an end to Doran's success at the highest level of competition though. Doran decks in the earliest days of Modern looked a bit different from what we've seen so far. While all the decks we've looked at run at least a little bit of disruption, Doran decks in Modern in 2011 and early 2012 took this to a new level by effectively being hate bear decks. In other words, these decks ran efficient creatures with highly disruptive effects, like Tide Hollow's Sculler, which messes with the opponent's hand, Kasali Pride Mage, which can destroy artifacts and enchantments, and Thalia Guardian of Thraben, which tax players for playing non-creature spells. You could also put Doran in the mix here, since his ability to tamper with how combat damage is dealt is certainly a hate effect against the right opponent. It was especially good against Delver decks, one of the most powerful, heavily played decks in the format, as it made all of its creatures worse. Insectile Aberration, Snapcaster Mage, and the aforementioned Vendilion Click all look a lot worse when you make them do damage equal to their toughness. In 2012, Doran decks received a nice upgrade in the form of Deathrite Shaman. It was a 1-mana 2-2 with Doran in play, and it still had all of its amazing activated abilities. Most notably, it could exile lands from graveyards for mana, something that was trivially easy to pull off because everyone played fetch lands. Doran decks continued to look like this for the next few years, but Doran's days in the format were numbered. You might think that the release of Khans of Tarkir in 2014, a set with an entire faction in Doran's 3 colors called Abzan, would result in a new golden age for Doran, but sadly it was not the case. Abzan decks did indeed become quite powerful, but it would largely be creatures from Tarkir block that would be played in modern Abzan decks. Many of them were insanely pushed, most notably Siege Rhino, so Doran only saw a little bit of play in these decks, and usually only as a singleton card. Doran put up its last major top 8 in any format in 2015 when he appeared as a one-of in an Abzan deck alongside Siege Rhino. It was certainly nice that the Rhino got even better with Doran around, But the Rhino itself is emblematic of what eventually pushed Doran out of being playable in competitive Magic. Over the years since Doran was printed, creatures increasingly were given Inter's triggers, like the Rhinos, which drains the opponent 3 life. As creatures were increasingly given effects like this, it became a big liability to run a creature that costs 3 mana that doesn't give you value no matter what happens, and Doran the Siege Tower just doesn't get there. In the end, he's pretty close to being a vanilla 3 mana 5/5, and vanilla creatures that are that expensive haven't been good in Modern for a very long time. Still, let's not dwell too long on the downfall of Doran. After all, the main purpose of this video was to tell you how good Doran was. And he was pretty darn good. Between 2007 and 2014, Doran was a centerpiece of an eponymous deck that put up many top 8s at major events, and even after 2014, Doran continued to see play in modern Abzan decks. When all was said and done, Doran's resume is pretty impressive. It achieved 1 World Championship, 4 Pro Tour top 8s, and 25 Grand Prix and Regional top 8s. While Doran might not look amazing today, he was once one of the most dominant creatures in the game, to the point that people were willing to warp their decks around him. Up until 2015, you had to be prepared to play with or against Doran in all 3 formats when he was legal in them, and while he was eventually overpowered by fellow Abzan creatures like Siege Rhino, he's really the first Abzan powerhouse creature we ever saw, and he set the stage for the others. So that's the history of Doran the Siege Tower. If you want to own your own Doran, because he is still a pretty sweet commander, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link. You can of course also find all of your other Magic needs in their store. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on the other episodes of this series, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.